Welcome to Cracking Cancer, where we tackle the tough questions about cancer with real patients and world experts. Our mission is to empower the cancer community through education, bring transparency to the oncology system, and drive funding for critical cancer research. Whether you're facing a diagnosis, supporting a loved one, or simply here to learn, we're here to bring clarity, hope, and action to the fight against cancer. Hey everyone, welcome to Cracking Cancer. I am your host, Dr. Kyle Concannon. I'm a physician scientist at the University of Colorado, and I am joined today by Max Doppelt.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
No, thanks for joining us. And today we wanted to go into a conference we were both at and kind of deconstruct what we got out of that conference, talk about what patients might get out of that conference. And this was the American Association for Cancer Research Conference in San Diego, AACR. It's probably one of the biggest translational researchy types of conferences that we have in cancer. People come from all over the world, and we were both fortunate to be able to attend. I was presenting some data that my lab had generated, and you were there through Patient Data Vault and the Exon 20 group. So yeah, I think it's the kind of conference that offers a lot to a lot of people, but may not necessarily be on patients' radar, and maybe that's rightfully so. But I wanted to dive into that together, Max. Maybe we can just kick off by saying, this was a very large conference. It was all about cancer research. What were your initial impressions upon going, and what made you want to go?
I think showing up, the scale of this particular conference was alarming and I think pretty new compared to the other conferences I went to. So I'm glad I eased into, I think from a caregiver's perspective, going to conferences, I eased into it with some other more personal conferences like the Targeted Therapies conference that I was at a couple months ago. And my goals going to these conferences are first and foremost to understand what is the cutting edge research for my mom and being an advocate for her. And I find these conferences are a great space to connect with other patient advocates, with physician scientists like yourself in a constructive way that's all about understanding what's going to be the latest and greatest for patients. So I think a lot of expectations, and this conference in particular was a pretty exciting, just seeing the scale of it and the pharmaceutical presence, and also I think connecting with various patient advocates.
And I'd be interested, you mentioned the scale of it. Can you kind of paint the picture for those listening who don't have a sense of what you mean by that? Yeah, maybe elaborate.
Well, I wish I got this advice ahead of time, but after the first day, another patient advocate who was attending said, "I hope you're wearing comfortable sneakers," because when I would go walk from one session to another, it could be a half a mile apart. Or if I had a meeting with one patient advocate and I was meeting with a physician, it could be on the total other side of the conference hall. And this conference hall is at least a half a mile long, and there are multiple halls. So just navigating around the site was very overwhelming.
Yeah, and for those who have been there, this is the San Diego Conference Center that's down by the Gaslamp District. So it's right on the water there. It's gorgeous, but it's beautiful. It's it's 2 stories. It's huge. It spans at least half a mile across the water there, and for several days, 4 or 5 days, it's nonstop cancer stuff. So you have in the big exhibit hall, you have where all the pharma stuff is and where everyone's kind of peddling their wares, so to speak. They're pitching their pharmaceutical drugs. They're, pitching research products. This is where we go to see what kind of pipettes one might use to, transfer liquids in the lab. Do you want to use this imaging thing versus that imaging thing? There's a huge pharmaceutical presence. And then on the sides of that, we had patient advocacy organizations like, us collectively, and then spread throughout in different sections are these large poster sessions where you have hundreds and hundreds of posters, meaning these are researchers who have assembled up their research in an organized way and put it on this tack board. And then you can go one by one throughout the hundreds and hundreds of posters, which change out every couple hours to a new set of hundreds and hundreds of posters to get a sense of the research that's going on. And then, in addition to the pharmaceutical stuff, the posters, then you have talks, which are happening throughout the day, every day, throughout the whole landscape. There's probably, over 100 talks in a given 3-hour period in any day. So there's a lot going on.
As an outsider, which I think from the patient advocacy perspective, while we had a section within the conference hall that we were designated for, it's completely overwhelming. And just hearing you recap that, it highlights I probably saw less than 1% of the information that was actually presented or discussed at the conference. So for someone who's showing up to that from a patient perspective, it's really important to have a general plan and understanding of what the goals are, what talks are you most interested in attending, and the days are long. So getting from place to place and making sure to eat something along the way. They had all these Auntie Anne trucks throughout
Yeah.
scattered throughout the conference. Also, I think I only ate pretzels for 4 days straight. It's really important.
Yeah, and to your point, where if you were to walk into that conference with just the mindset of I want to see what's going on, what's new in cancer treatment, or even if you are, I want to see what's new in breast cancer, walking through the front door there, you wouldn't even know where to start. There's just so many ways to slice the pie of research of where everything is at what time. Is it a talk? Is it a poster? There's so much going on that going in with a plan would be absolutely necessary to make heads or tails of it. And maybe for the folks listening, for those who are interested in better educating themselves into this world of cancer research, what kind of stuff did you see when you were walking through the halls and the talks or posters that you were interacting with?
I felt the companies providing pharmaceutical products was really cool. So you mentioned like the mouse models and all the uh, pharmaceutical testing products. I thought that was really cool to see, and it's exciting to see such cutting edge display of research, but it's really hard to engage with any of that. Couple that with, I think, the medical research that was being presented. So, not having a medical background or a degree or PhD in some biology related field, it's really hard to show up to a poster and know what questions to ask and engage with a PhD scientist who's presenting their poster. The knowledge gap in that conversation is pretty striking. So I think I focused my conference at a much lower knowledge level, which was really focused about the patient advocacy connections. The patient advocates who are there are more specifically experts in their research field. So they'll highlight posters that are exciting to them. And then I'll try to schedule a conversation with them after they've gone through a day of posters and kind of understand from them what's exciting. So I think that translation is important because it's really hard to connect with, I think, on the product side, everything in the conference hall, and then also on the research side.
No, I think it's so funny you mentioned that because the different lenses that we approach that meeting are pretty striking. Not that it's unexpected, but as a scientist myself, I'm there. We have a poster. We're presenting the data that we generated in my laboratory, and there are a lot of patients and patient advocates there. And the feeling that that element may be less accessible to them is tough to swallow as a scientist who's interested in having their kind of research known, including to people who have that disease. But I would say, on the whole, I totally agree. That is not the lens through which this particular conference is viewing its purpose. This is largely a scientist to scientist kind of conference. Um, did you find that off putting, or did you think that you were still able to get what you wanted out of the conference despite a lot of the jargon?
I understood that going in, and I tried to accommodate for it. So one question I was asked when I came back from the conference, someone asked me, "How many patients attend a conference like AACR? Like, what percent of the conference are patients or caregivers? And I'm curious what you would answer that, but I think it has to be 1% at most, like a very, very small percent. What do you
Yeah,
think?
I would definitely say single digits because, I mean, even if you were to consider the entirety of the conference, what strata is like pharma versus non pharma, half is pharma.
Right.
So, and then you have scientists from all over the world. I mean, they're coming from every continent to this conference. So that degree of travel and influx just from scientific collaboration, yeah, that's at least the other 45%. The last, I mean, you have the people that work there. There's probably
Right.
more people that work there than patients.
Yeah. And they're all on motorized vehicles because everything is so far apart. It was really funny to see you have patients walking a half a mile and then the staff in cars, mini golf carts, driving around the conference hall. It was quite an interesting dynamic.
Well, and it's
But
interesting.
yeah,
This particular organization, AACR, really does push to have patients like welcomed and be there. So I don't think it's that the research organizations don't want it. I think they do. But it's tough when you want to have the scientists showcase their stuff in the language that, they've spent the last 10 years learning and curating. And um, it's tough to make that accessible to the person who doesn't have that biologic and scientific background and still maintain the effect just because of how efficient you have to be with your time. The vast amount of data that's presented at AACR is really prohibitive, I think, to make everything completely accessible to the patient. But I would say we're not necessarily also doing the greatest job of trying.
well, I'll give you kudos to you because there was one poster session where you kind of took me under your wing and I was following you, listening to the questions you were asking, and we went through maybe hundreds of posters. And that was really interesting for me because while I didn't necessarily understand the conversations you were having in the moment, we were able to digest and recap after a discussion about a particular poster about how it could be relevant for research relating to my mom or another type of cancer of interest. So that layer could be something the AACR could work on and highlight recap sessions for patients or just patient targeted materials, almost like a tour guide for patients would be something really interesting. And it would help curate the content for the physician scientists who also would struggle kind of connecting patient to patient.
Yeah, or that high level overview could just be on the poster in the bottom right corner. You have, what is your key takeaway in an accessible vernacular? Like, what is this all about? Although it's interesting because a lot of the stuff at that conference is technological advances that like I don't even understand. So it may be hard to make that um, entry level friendly because like you just have to know these terms that you may not know. So I think more strides could definitely be done, but that is a good example of a conference where it's going to be challenging to make everything accessible even to everyone who's in the field and they're learning. But I remember when we were chatting and we were kind of going through the posters and stuff, thinking how frustrating it must be if you're a patient or a caregiver and you're in your position saying, I want to do the best thing for my loved one or myself. And you're looking through to try to find what are the seeds of hope or, what's a tether here I can pull on to try to improve the situation of myself or a loved one. And like navigating that would be so hard. And there'd be so much anxiety around trying to find a concrete data point or leave with some takeaway opportunities or messages. I think you went in with a very open mind. And I think that was the ticket to not being necessarily disappointed just from its vast quantity of information. Although the flip side of that is their app and everything were actually pretty good. So if you knew what you were looking for, you could find it ahead of time. But again, making that plan would definitely be critical.
Yeah, it's a huge burden to have to put that planning together. So I think the AACR having coordinated tracks depending on who the participant is really important. So there was a patient advocacy lunch I attended that was set up by the AACR, and that was an amazing opportunity for patients and advocates alike to step outside the complete research focus of the conference and have a discussion about barriers to access clinical trials. That was the discussion at the lunch roundtable. So I think by highlighting different tracks depending on who the participant is, and that's where the app does come into play. They're using smart algorithms to showcase different different events and posters, booths to attend, depending on who the participant is really impactful, and it takes a bit of the burden off of the patient showing up to have to navigate this massive space.
Yeah, and beyond the patient advocacy realm, did you find information about Exon 20? That's the kind of small niche in regards to the vast landscape of AACR that you had some personal relevance to with your mom. Were you able to identify relevant research that you thought was interesting or useful?
No,
Was
not
that
particularly.
what was the biggest barrier?
I think that is a big barrier that I go into these conferences understanding, or it's really through the lens of what's clinically relevant for my mom. So for me to focus on individual research papers that are, in terms of relevance, could be 3 to 5 years away from having any clinical relevance, it's not on my radar or what my objectives were for the conference.
It's an interesting point, particularly with the time lag behind what might be a preclinical finding, meaning something that was observed in the laboratory. And that's the kind of stuff that's presented at these conferences like the American Association for Cancer Research, is this is mostly stuff that is biological or technological advances. And you may find something that's really interesting that may highlight our understanding of cancer biology and how this particular mutation may affect X, Y, and Z. But whether that leads to a valuable therapeutic target or a new strategy for targeting cancer, that conference may not necessarily have that. So I think if you're the kind of person who is going to that cutting edge conference, which I would say this is kind of at the cutting edge of what's coming out, you're going to see it there. But you can see something that looks really promising on that poster or in that talk, and it still be, yeah, years and years and years away, if it ever hits clinic. And that's something that can be really frustrating.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm not going to share my screen, but I just pulled up because the patient advocacy group that I attended the conference with, they curated all of the posters that were and abstracts that were published in AACR's leading up to the conference, and identified there were 11 EGFR related posters to target. And I went to a bunch of them, and going back to kind of highlight our previous conversation about just the knowledge level to really learn something meaningful from one of these posters, it was just it's not my technical background. And it's something that I relied on the patient advocates who were attending to to know what questions to ask and determine how clinically relevant it is towards the future. But yeah, having that curated list and searching for the poster, they were presented on multiple sides. So depending on what section the poster is in, they could be a 15-minute walk apart. So I just had different objectives for the conference, and I think it's really tough to learn much from a research perspective without the medical background.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that they found 11, and that seems really low to me. But I guess when I was there, I don't recall seeing a ton on EGFR, that specific mutation. Um, what kinds of things did the advocates you were working with say about these posters? Did they think they were relevant? Were they excited about anything?
Not particularly. I, the one area that I think is underexplored in a clinical sense today is resistance mechanisms. So when someone progresses on an EGFR therapy, what types of resistance mutations show up? So there were some posters analyzing it in a preclinical sense, but it's just way less tangible in terms of understanding how patients, how patients would actually take action depending on that. So I think there was, and this is more in your space, CAR T cell. There were some posters that were really interesting about that. That's just like similar to what I said, just a bit above my head. So I keep a optimistic hope that this incredible research will translate to clinical relevance, and the research that has preceded this for that has been presented at AACR for the past 5 years is coming up in the clinic, and that's where I think most of the focus from me as a patient and caregiver to my mom is right now.
Well, and it's really challenging to see the kinds of biology that are interesting in the scientific community. And a lot of times those are pretty far away from clinical translation. I mean, right now, the using this example of this mutation EGFR, um, most of the mutations within that protein are targeted by one medicine and have been for the last, 5, 10 years. So there hasn't been tremendous technologic advancement um, in at least in that biological sense that is translated to like a new frontline therapy. We have other therapies that are effective now that we didn't have before, but it didn't necessarily come by through better understanding resistance biology. And the reason I'm mentioning that is just because this stuff is really hard. So the likelihood that research funnels into something that is translatable into a new trial or something like that is often pretty low. And I find it interesting. This is a conversation I've had with other folks too. One could look at, okay, if I give this EGFR inhibitor, let's say the one your mother is on, or maybe on, and then we look at how those tumors change over time. What could you then next target it with? Would it be chemotherapy? Would it be an antibody? These kinds of things. That is interesting. And using things that are already commercially available is kind of low hanging fruit. But I don't think that gets the same level of scientific credit than if you generate something novel yourself or you identify some new mechanism, whether it's targetable or not. And this is I wouldn't say a frustration, but a limitation that I've seen with the way our incentive structures are built in preclinical medicine and research, where you're incentivized to discover something. And discovering that you can use this treatment after that treatment isn't really that technologically novel or groundbreaking or exciting. Um, Whereas if you were to spend your time looking into certain pathways that change and things like that, understanding how tumors may adapt and maybe identifying a protein that's relevant that you didn't know was relevant before, those kinds of things that are cellular biology and more preclinical, like more of the basic biology, I feel like those things are incentivized a little more, even if they're not clinically useful. At least often they're not clinically useful.
That's pretty hard to track as a patient. So I don't. So it's probably a small percent of patients even know what their biomarker is and actionable mutations. But then going down the list, when someone gets back that NGS report with all of the other biomarkers that may not have clinical relevance today, it's really tough to curate that and then show up to AACR and know what those markers are, and then seek to explore what 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 could be clinically relevant. I didn't have the necessarily have the time to do that for my mom's case. Is that something you think? that could be interesting for a future conference?
Well, that's a great example because most of the things that you're going to find in your molecular report for a tumor mutation report is you're going to see a lot of tumors that are mutated. And if you look, you may find people who have done research on those different proteins that when they're altered, they cause X, Y, or Z to happen. And that is the kind of biology that you're likely to see at a conference like AACR, or at least it's enriched there. Like that would be a good home for it. Now, whether that's targetable or not, who knows? Often no, usually no. But it does tell you, oh, when you have a mutation here, it causes this error in the repair of DNA. And that's how this worsens tumor outcomes. And I liken it to when I was in clinical rotations, I was in neurology. And one of the elements of neurology that you have to learn when you're becoming a doctor is to localize where a stroke happened. So you have to study the patient, you have to understand where their deficits are, their speech patterns, and their, all these things that will associate with a certain element of the brain. Then left to right side, is it in this location or that location? And you're tested on this, and you have to be able to do that fairly well. And then you just get MRI, or you just get the CT scan. And it's like, well, why did we do all the mechanistic stuff if the result is whatever the scan told us? So I find that kind of similar logic with a lot of the preclinical stuff to say, we're doing all this investigation to understand why this thing that we know is harmful. And sure, rarely those will be targetable. And that's kind of the hope you hold out for, is that by better understanding the tumor biology, you can one day leverage that for a therapeutic gain. But there's a pendulum that swings between things that are really clinically actionable and things that are really basic biology. And I think the pendulum has swung more toward that basic biology sense, at least in terms of what's incentivized and what people can build careers on. And it'd be interesting if we could swing a little more toward implementing the discoveries we've already made and saying, how can we leverage what already exists in exciting new ways to optimize the tools we have in hand? I'm of the belief that we can cure cancers with the tools we have now by using them to their maximal effectiveness. But that's not necessarily what's incentivized, I think, in the scientific community and as people build careers. Taking something someone else discovered and saying, if I use it in this particular way, it can be more effective, is less impressive than discovering something yourself.
I'll add just a general takeaway from the scale of the conference. I'm just so impressed by the scientists, and when I was walking around with you and hearing how knowledgeable and passionate each person behind the poster was, and it wasn't hundreds of people. I think it was thousands of people. It really takes the backdrop and this narrative that we're not in there's a lack of funding for our scientists. It was encouraging for me to see that there were thousands of people in this 4-day time span deeply committed to solving this really painful problem in my life and many families, and that is happening, and the work is happening every day, and it hasn't stopped. So that was really encouraging to see when you read the news, you hear all sorts of things.
Yeah, and it is a large group of people that I think are really dedicated to this fight, and they really do want to work together to come up with better treatments and cures for individuals with cancer. And everyone has their own part to play. We can't be experts across the spectrum of cancer biology. So you rather have tens of thousands of people, for example, at that conference, who each have a tiny little sliver of what their expertise is. And one of the benefits, for me as a researcher going through those posters, is I get to look through and see which of these elements, or how they're thinking about things, their approaches, their technologies, what will synergize really well with what I'm doing, and can we work together? Um, and I think those kinds of conferences are really, really good for that. They're really, really good for peer to peer, like physician to physician, scientist to scientist communication and collaboration. And that's a conference where a lot of people really are open to doing that. Um, so those conversations really do happen. I had those conversations with my peers to talk about what they're doing and how we could potentially work together to be more effective.
That's amazing. And I know we spoke about it when we were walking around, different components of how to share data, share resources across institutions, because there are so many ways I envision collaboration can happen, but it really does require getting people in the same room. And it's such a burden on your schedule to step away from your patients and family, and for everyone, it's a similar burden. So it's encouraging to see those conversations happening. And to your point, I think from the patient perspective, while it's less it's less of an area for me to directly contribute, it's really helpful, nice to see.
Well, and I'm coming at it from like a niche subject matter expert perspective. You're a systems person. You know, it's so interesting that I'm looking through their kind of poster by poster to try to find, could this work well with what I'm doing, which is very time intensive. But are different pieces of the pie, like what I'm presenting and what someone else is presenting, is not connected in any other way. There's no network that connects my idea with their idea based on what we presented and says, hey, these things would actually synergize well together. You should talk. So I find it really interesting, as an AI developer, do you see opportunities for these kinds of research realms, these conferences to implement synergistic solutions to complex problems?
I love that idea. For instance, I mean, if you take every abstract poster and the AACR could run a similarity search across all the posters and recommend who should meet with each other, whose work overlaps the most with each other. That's kind of how my brain approaches the problem. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for that, and also extending that to the research community. I don't know, does Google Scholar? I know they link papers based on citations, but that's another area where I was pretty involved in the research community during my master's degree, and I think there was so much cross institution collaboration because of that. It was so easily trackable within Google Google Scholars, and that's something could be really useful for the AACR to, when they're receiving those abstracts up front, to just recommend where what's the similarity score, where people facilitate those connections.
No, that's a brilliant idea. Like right now, I don't know if you remember how the posters were laid out, but it's laid out in topics,
Right.
which
Each
is
column was a different topic, and it was a different topic depending on also the day and time.
right. So it's like there's so many different layers, but the topic itself might be the tumor microenvironment, meaning immune cells that are around cancer. And that is one way to think of things. But let's say you're a pancreatic cancer researcher. That may be more relevant to be next to someone who's studying pancreatic cancer prevention and pancreatic cancer treatment response and pancreatic cancer, progression signatures. That group of different topics that are all around pancreatic cancer may be more relevant to the individual researchers themselves, even though only one of them is working in the tumor microenvironment. That's a cursory example, but a similarity index, something that says which things are most likely to be related, maybe we should put those near each other so those people can talk. Because as it is right now, I mean, unless you started at one end of the conference center and just walked back and forth throughout the rows, and then went to the middle and walked back and forth throughout all those rows, and then went to the other end and walked back and forth throughout those rows. And that would be that session's over now. And then it would be another session. And then you go do it again. Like, unless you did that for like 3 days straight, there's no way you're going to see all the posters and interact with people. So the likelihood you're going to meet like-minded people who have something that you could potentially collaborate around is pretty low.
I think it's great that they do that geographic grouping, but to the point you just made, there are multiple second, third line vectors that they could group posters and individuals by. So I know they're investing more and more in their digital app. And I think that's a great opportunity to keep investing in the digital app, because you can extend far beyond the geography. Because I don't know how someone could possibly see every poster in 3 hours. They'd have to be like sprinting between them. It could be an interesting something to watch.
Well, and then while all the poster sessions are happening, there are lectures. And I mean, I go there and I'm meeting with pharmaceutical companies. So we're talking about potential trials. We're talking about new ways to use their medicines that they, that's kind of on the cutting edge there. So to be able to accomplish all those goals is hard in of itself. And that's while seeing, a sliver of what the conference has to offer. Yeah, there's a lot to pack in. What do you
Yeah.
think was the most effective element that you took away from your attendance of that conference?
The patient advocacy lunch roundtable, because all the attendees were there. They had research oriented focus, and I think separate goals for themselves. But to just put that kind of set aside of designated time for all the advocates to be in a room together to think about problems from the patient's perspective, that was a really powerful lunch, because I got to connect with, although we were all kind of spread out and some were presenting posters, and it put us all in the same room. And it was a really meaningful discussion.
In terms of getting value out of the conference in general, how would this compare to other conferences that you've been to from a patient advocacy perspective?
I think really valuable. You and I, we went to a dinner with it was quite the collection of individuals. It was a physician scientist, a PhD, caregiver, a patient, husband of a patient, and then another caregiver. So it was just a collective coming together of people, and it was such a lovely evening. And I thought the conversation was just so impactful. I feel like all of us left that dinner feeling impacted, and that's something I think across, when I look at a conference and my time there, those connections are, I mean, so important than any literature I read or piece of knowledge that I learned.
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point. One of the biggest benefits of attending these conferences is that other people are attending these conferences. So I often will look at it through the lens of what's the data being presented? How can we move the field forward together with that? But the reality is at the base of all of the scientific advancement are the people that are doing it. And they're doing it because they care, and they're doing it because this is what they've dedicated their lives toward. And if you're someone who's in the field, either as a patient, patient advocate, researcher, what have you, it is a good opportunity to connect with other individuals who share this underlying mission. And I think people would be surprised at how accessible individuals are in the field. Um, like I didn't have dinner plans that evening that you're mentioning, and then one of the folks reached out and was like, sure, I'll go grab dinner, and ended up being a great time. And we talked about a wide variety of topics. But that may be true for a lot of other scientists too. There was a different night where I met with colleagues from multiple different institutions that we all study similar stuff, and we're talking about different ways that we can look at the same problem and glean from each other's expertise, and those build ongoing collaborations. And so I think you raise a really good point that the people are probably the most valuable element of any of these conferences. And one of the benefits of a conference like AACR, compared to some of the smaller ones that are throughout the country and world, is that there are just so many people at AACR that you may have to seek out who's there and then reach out to whoever that may be to achieve a certain goal. But there's a pretty high likelihood that someone relevant will be there.
Yeah, and compared to because this was I think the third conference I went to in the past month and a half. The other two, one was Texas Lung, and the other was the Targeted Therapies Conference. And in each one, I think there were those special moments and connections with other patients, and it's so great to see patients from conference to conference, and as a touch point to catch up. And but the material, it does really vary from conference to conference, and it's just having the right expectations going in. That I think the set programming was less relevant for me this time than I think some of the other conferences. For instance, a targeted therapies conference. My mom is literally on a targeted therapy. So all the sessions were just super relevant, and the speakers were presenting data on the drugs that she was taking. So it it was more narrowly focused, and it was a bit more seamless to navigate as a patient.
Yeah, and I think that's what another great point is that these big conferences like the AACR conference, it's all types of tumors. So the conference is really vast because there's a lot to cover. But if you're there looking for something specific to you, I mean, there's just so much there. It's really hard to do that. Hard to necessarily find the people that are going to be in the same relevant camp as you and connect with them unless you do the legwork ahead of time. And even then, acknowledging that you're identifying the cutting edge, this stuff may never make it to clinic. The things that are clinically relevant may never make it to clinic. The mechanisms that people uncover in the research may never be relevant. But that's the nature of cancer research as a whole, is most of what we do doesn't translate to a therapy. It doesn't translate to an outcome. But the process hopefully pushes us closer and closer to that. It's just cancer is such a complicated topic. I'm not sure many people appreciate how different every cancer type is from each other. And then you have all the different treatments that are available within a cancer type and understanding how cancers evolve throughout those treatments. Every different cancer type has different prevention methods that people are looking into, diagnostic testing. And then you have, what do you do in low resource areas of the world? How do you treat those individuals? So yeah, it's such a vast field, and AACR is an area where all that congregates together in a beautiful way for collaboration. But if you walk in without a game plan, it can be just pure chaos.
Definitely.
Well, great. I don't have a whole lot else to dive into for AACR. I just wanted to make sure that individuals had a good sense if they were interested in attending this conference, what they might expect. Um, Anything along that vein that you think we left out, Max, or do you think we about covered it?
I think the one thing I also wanted to touch on was that we were running booths side by side. One was the patient advocacy group I was volunteering for, and then you were had a booth for the Cracking Cancer podcast. And by crazy coincidence, they were side by side out of probably 50 booths. So I was really appreciative of that. I was able to speak and kind of step in when you were walking around to so many interesting people who were walking by. So I think having the booth was a really interesting part of this conference, and I was really glad that the someone from above made sure that those two booths were next to each other.
Yeah, and to commend AACR for offering booth space, for
Yeah,
the advocacy organizations and the things that we're all trying to do. Not every conference can do that, and to make it very financially accessible. Um, some conferences charge quite a bit to let individuals have some space because they don't have the same availability that the ACR did. So that's a cost that they had to eat to make that happen. And I thought I'm very appreciative that they were able to do it. And I think they did a really good job.
it was a really great part of the conference. It was a home base. It helped facilitate connections with other patient advocates, and it made me feel more comfortable there.
Yeah. No, well said. Well, great. With that, I think we'll cut it. Thanks everyone for listening. Hopefully you got something out of this. If that's a conference you're thinking about joining next year, um, usually in San Diego. So even if the conference doesn't offer much, the weather's beautiful and you can at least go to the zoo or go to the beach or something, and you'll get something
Exactly.
out of it. Yeah. And the food down there I think is pretty good. So
Really good.
yeah, I had a good time. All right. Well, everyone, we will catch you later. This has been Cracking Cancer, and you can go to crackingcancer.org for more info. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Cracking Cancer. If you found this helpful, please like, subscribe, leave us a review, and visit crackingcancer.org for more information. Every dollar we earn goes directly to furthering the podcast and supporting vital cancer research. Because together, we can crack cancer.